Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our discussion this evening on measuring well-being. I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, Associate Professor and Chair of Sociology at the Catholic University of America. And I'll be moderating our panel, which is sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology. Now, as a sociologist, a point of frustration for me has been our discipline has been so fixated on critique. We point out what's wrong with the world. We have courses and journals on social problems. But what are the assumptions of the good underlying those critiques? We rarely articulate those, and instead we smuggle in assumptions about human flourishing and well-being. We can't do without it. And maybe the reason we do so, maybe the reason we hide these assumptions is that it's such a thorny issue. There's no consensus on what counts as well-being and how we should measure it. There are formidable conceptual and practical challenges. But I think those questions of how to conceptualize and measure well-being are inescapable. This is why the volume we're discussing today by Matthew Lee, Laura Kubsansky, and Tyler Vanderweel is so important. We'll post a link to the book in the chat. The book is accessible for free at Oxford University Press. Measuring well-being is an ambitious step towards a well-ordered science of well-being, which itself is crucial for improving policies that shape our society. The volume brings together scholars from a wide range of disciplines: philosophy, psychology, sociology, economics, health sciences, epidemiology, public policy, theology. Might be missing something. I'm especially excited about this book since we here are in the process of launching a new Center for the Study of Institutional Flourishing. So I found the considerations raised in this volume to be immensely helpful. Now, the contributors to the volume haven't by any means solved the challenges entailed in measuring well-being. They offer some convergent recommendations, but it's by no means a trite, lowest common denominator position statement. And in fact, the book also includes some disagreement and dialogue amongst the contributors. This evening, our panel is an attempt to continue this important interdisciplinary conversation with scholars from the fields of philosophy, economics, sociology, and psychology. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Matthew Lee, who is Director of Empirical Research at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, who's one of the editors of the volume. Dr. Jennifer Frey, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, who is Assistant Professor and Director of Social Research at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Bo Weston, who is Van Winkle Professor of Sociology at Centre College. And Dr. Matt Bloom, who is Research Professor at the Mendoza Business School at the University of Notre Dame, where he's a PI of a major study on well-being at work. This evening, we'll begin with a presentation of the book from Dr. Lee, then responses by Dr. Frey, Dr. Pakaluk, Dr. Weston, and Dr. Bloom. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after. Thanks once again for joining us, and we can begin with Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Brandon, for that kind introduction and for organizing this event. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful to everyone at the Institute for Human Ecology who helped to organize as well. I'd like to thank my co-editors, Tyler and Laura, and also all of the contributors to the volume for their contributions. Thanks also to the panelists who've taken their time today to respond to our work and advance the conversation, and to everyone who showed up for this event or who will watch it once it's recorded and posted. I'm delighted to be with you. Our edited volume began life as an interdisciplinary conference at Harvard in April of 2018, with support from the John Templeton Foundation, as well as support from the Center for Health and Happiness and the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. The conference fostered 2 days of lively conversation about measuring well-being from a number of perspectives, including economics, philosophy, psychology, public health, sociology, statistics, and theology. We gathered 30 scholars from universities such as Harvard, Imperial College London, British Columbia, Oxford, and others to debate long-standing issues and chart a course forward. This group obviously does not represent the entire world, but the goal was to bring together some of the leading scholars who were interested in interdisciplinary dialogue. And certainly at the Human Flourishing Program, we have research planned on a global scale to fill in some of the gaps. Some chapters in the volume were jointly authored by scholars from the humanities and social sciences. Others represent a single discipline, but contribute to the interdisciplinary conversation. The last 4 chapters present a dialogue between a number of scholars on proposed recommendations on the selection of measures for well-being that can be used for different purposes, such as national well-being surveys that inform policy changes or multi-use cohort studies that explain causal relations between psychological and social conditions and well-being outcomes. The discussion considers the meaning of the term well-being and the merits of different measurement strategies. And it goes without saying that, as often is the case in science, consensus was not reached, but there are some hopeful recommendations that come out of that section. Few would oppose improving well-being, but debates about what well-being means, how to assess it, and how to enhance it are certain to occupy scholars, policymakers, and laypersons for years to come. According to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there is, quote, no consensus around a single definition of well-being, end quote. We hope that our volume helps to advance the conversation. I will offer a few remarks today to place our work in a broader context. But first, it's helpful to experience well-being directly. And I will share my screen so that we can do that. So for those of you who have seen this fictionalized account of the life of and work of children's television show host Mr. Rogers, you remember this scene, very vivid scene in the movie. And there's a moment where a journalist is sort of very unhappy, and Fred Rogers asks him to stop and take just a minute along with him to think of all the people who have loved him into being. So I'll invite us to do this now. And this exercise has been adapted by a clinical instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School, Susan Pakaluk, into a meditation. So I will invite us to do this now. Start by sitting comfortably and give yourself a moment to anchor yourself. You can keep your eyes open or close them as it's comfortable. And perhaps when you're ready, just call to mind one person who has helped you become who you are, who has loved you into being. Don't try to find a perfect relationship, but just somebody who has helped you. Someone who wanted the very best for you in life. And just spend a few moments taking this in, allowing yourself to feel the connection and feel the gratitude. Rest in feeling loved and cared about, knowing that you matter and that you have worth. And finally, as Fred Rogers noted, this person, wherever they are, would be pleased to know the difference that they have made. So that's 1 minute, and it sort of combines a gratitude exercise and a savoring exercise. And this is really important to well-being, and it helps us connect with the reality that our well-being depends on those who have loved us into being. So what is well-being and what is it for? Well, many scholars, especially in the humanities, have argued that the proper ends of human life should align with the kind of being that humans are. So in most ethical systems, happiness and deepest well-being is a byproduct of virtuous actions that benefit self and others. And we talk about this in some of our chapters, and I've showed in the book here, Measuring Well-Being, there's the cover. on the screen. This is discussed in a number of chapters. It's also discussed in this wonderful book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing, where math is really about fostering virtue so that you can flourish and help others flourish. And I sort of wish some of my math teachers had read that when I was in school. But so what is well-being and what is it for? So we spend a lot of time talking about what well-being is, discussing that, debating that. And at the end of the volume, we have a concluding chapter, and I'll read just a half a paragraph from page 560 on what is well-being for. And we start by saying Maslow argued that happiness, the psychologist Abraham Maslow, argued that happiness and other conventional measures of individual well-being are not the proper aim of life. Rather, the goal is to reach a higher level of human development, to become, in his words, a sound member of the human species. For Christian theologians, including one in the volume who we quote here, at the core of the Christian ideal of spiritual life stands the practice of neighbor love, end quote. It would seem then that happiness as a byproduct of virtuous actions that benefit others and self is preferable in most ethical systems to just coping and or to selfish hedonism. Promoting good even in difficult situations and reliably doing what is right as a leader in a community is central to well-being. So our well-being is inextricably bound up with the well-being of others. So the US or the World Happiness Report, I think last year, no, 2019, sorry, declared that the US is a mass addiction society. And one of our program affiliates, Arthur Brooks, writing in October of 2020 in the magazine The Atlantic, said that despite great advances in the quality of life across the income scale in the United States, average happiness is decreasing and has been for some years. The General Social Survey shows a long-term gradual decline in happiness and rise in unhappiness from 1988 to the present. And then he concludes, don't trade love for anything. In Mathematics for Human Flourishing, Francis Su writes near the end of the book, to love and be loved is the supreme mark of human flourishing. Love, the source of and end of all other virtues. So there's some information here about what is deepest well-being, and then what is well-being for. Well-being is grounded in love, and it's about helping others flourish, and we flourish ourselves when we do that. There are a number of ways to measure well-being, and you can find some discussion of community well-being in chapter 14 by Tyler Vanderweel. And this particular chapter offers this graphic here showing the 4 dimensions of well-being: communal versus individual, and then objective versus subjective. So it's helpful to understand how individuals feel about their own subjective experience of flourishing and well-being, and also to understand how objectively they're doing. And the same with communities. So I think that when we have a conversation about well-being, sometimes we're focused only on the subjective experiences of individuals. And one of the points of the book is to broaden that conversation. There are a number of multi-systemic models of flourishing or complete well-being. And I've shown you 3 here. The first was developed by our program director, Tyler Vanderweel, and it shows the kind of 5 core domains that we've established are nearly universally desired and ends in themselves: happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. And then the notion is that you need some level of financial and material stability to sustain those domains, but that the material considerations are perhaps not ends in themselves. And then we recognize that there is a strong body of literature that suggests that these domains are realized through social institutions, through our participation in family, work, education, religious community, and others. The blue zones model is quite popular now. In the base of this pyramid, this is the image in the middle, is belonging, creating a healthy social network, connecting, reconnecting with religion, prioritizing family. That's sort of the foundation, and then other aspects are built on top of that. All the way to the right side is a circle, and this shows really 3 levels of well-being. And this was produced by the International Multiple Sclerosis Association. And it looks at me in the sort of upper left, my physical health, my mental health, my attitudes, but also the upper right, my immediate circumstances, my relationships, my finances and resources. And then at the bottom here, my wider environment. What are the laws and policies that directly impinge upon my well-being, or the national or global economy, the sustainability issue as well. So there are a number of different ways to put together well-being into a multi-systemic model of flourishing. There's some emerging work now trying to connect personal well-being to well-doing. And the inaugural conference of life improvement science was held this year, and one of our research affiliates presented some of our work there. And the idea is that we need transdisciplinary research to investigate how we can help people do more good in better ways and to be well while they're doing it. So this new attempt to bring together, to integrate disciplines is most welcome and entirely consistent with our volume. The organizers seek to understand the psychological and sociocultural mechanisms of well-doing in tandem with developing tools and interventions that help people grow, live a meaningful life, and make valuable contributions to others. So at the top of this pyramid, you see solving global problems. And another way to look at this is to directly connect well-being to equity. And the Well-Being in the Nation Network and others, Well-Being and Equity in the World, 100 Million Healthier Lives, have been doing this work and developed this theory of change, where you can sort of respond to the crisis of the day in the bottom half of this model, responding to adversity and urgent needs, but in such a way that you're reproducing trauma and exclusion and ignoring equity. And that's not a path to meaningful transformation or sustainable well-being. It sort of keeps you locked in this cycle of suffering. What we need are stewards of the system who are able to help foster vital conditions for everyone, creating this kind of well-being economy rooted in dignity and inclusion. So at the bottom here, we sort of have resilience amidst adversity. And at the top, it would look like this: healthy soil, greater flourishing for everyone. And so thinking more systemically about connecting individual well-being to the broader thriving of the world is really, I think, the cutting edge right now. And system stewardship in this way is beautiful, truthful, and good. These are the 3 transcendentals. So this is my last slide. I guess I'm almost out of time. So what does well-being look like? Well, I like this smiling face here of Akbar Cook, principal of West Side High School in Newark, New Jersey. Well-being, as he demonstrates, involves the joy of loving others into being by transcending difficult circumstances. So he was quoted in an article, a newspaper article, saying, you know what, I'm not going into the summer being a bystander. I'm going to do something about all of the violence directed at the kids in my school. And he said, I'm a kid that grew up in the Boys and Girls Club. So let's open the school doors on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 to 11, because that's when the crime was happening. Let's provide a safe space for them. They needed us, so we just loved on them and provided all these resources. So not being stuck in the sense that there's nothing we can do, but looking creatively for opportunities to nurture others, to love others into being, and then to experience well-being ourselves. He says we had to go at them a different way. We've led with love, being consistent and loved on them until they realized we weren't going anywhere, making that commitment to stand with them. And then he says, you know, kids weren't coming to school. Some students weren't showing up because they were wearing dirty clothes and getting bullied because of it. So what can the school do? They marshaled community resources to install commercial grade washing machines and dryers to deal with this problem, to help provide the resource that was missing in students' lives. So I think it's helpful for us to end with an individual human example of what well-being looks like when we are helping to love others into being and flourishing ourselves. Thank you for your time, and I welcome further conversation from the panelists.
Wonderful, thank you, Matt. I invite Dr. Frey to go next.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was a really beautiful presentation. And thanks to Brandon for inviting me to be a part of this panel and for giving me the opportunity to read and discuss what I think is a very comprehensive and really very thought-provoking book. Just to kind of say more about where I'm coming from professionally, I'm a philosopher. Most of my work is on virtue and moral psychology and sort of human agency more broadly construed. And for a lot of my academic career, I've been doing some work that intersects with the social sciences. But for 3 years, I was on an interdisciplinary project with theologians. It was sort of philosophers, theologians, and social scientists. And we were trying to see if we could hammer out something like an agreement about the connections between virtue, right, as a stable disposition of thought, feeling, and action, and then, you know, conceptions of happiness and also meaning in life. And after 3 years of doing that work, I came away with a commitment that's fairly strong. And the commitment is this: we really can't talk about happiness or meaning in life in a purely descriptive way. These are basically normative concepts that involve some kind of standard of objective goodness and badness. If they weren't normative concepts, then there would be no reason to suppose that they were choice-worthy, let alone objects of, you know, human aspiration and, you know, goals for practical deliberation. And so I don't think we can make a whole lot of progress without acknowledging that what constitutes human nature and human flourishing can't just be a matter of looking at what most people are feeling or doing or up to, which is to say that subjective self-reports probably aren't going to be enough. We're going to have some kind of thick normative concepts against which we could measure what people are saying from a subjective perspective. So just kind of call this the normative problem. I think that it's a problem that constantly comes up when we're doing this kind of interdisciplinary work. And what I want to do with my 10 minutes this afternoon is just to highlight ways that the normative problem came up for me as I was working my way through some of the essays in this book. I wasn't able to read all of them. Just in order to suggest, right, that what the normative problem points to is the need for a really thick and substantive account of human nature that we can have some kind of consensus about as we're doing this work. And that this is, like, you know, probably the most controversial thing I'll say, and that is that we really can't think about it apart from virtue, right? There's no there's no path to progress here that doesn't have virtue kind of at the center of it. So I'll start just by responding to the first essay in the volume on measuring and using happiness to support public policies by John Hallowell. So I guess, right, one of my questions is, look, I mean, what possible use for like public policy purposes is the data that we get from self-reports on an individual's subjective perspective on their own happiness? We know, that human powers of introspective self-assessment are sort of weak and unreliable. In part, that's just because in a lot of ways we're self-deceived. We kind of instinctively try to protect ourselves, especially from painful truths. Nobody really wants to admit that they're unhappy. But even if we could do a lot better on that front, there's still the normative problem, right? So if anybody had asked Eichmann in early 1940 if he was satisfied with his life, if he thought his life was going well, given everything that we know about him, we might think that, he might score himself pretty high on these measures. If you look at the questions that they're asking, there's no reason why he wouldn't give himself high points because, for the first time in his life, things are going really well for Eichmann, both professionally and socially. But, his whole job, right, is to be the architect of genocide, right? And so while he might feel really good about where he is, obviously we all know that he shouldn't feel that way, right? He should have a bad conscience, et cetera. And I think this example, which is obviously extreme, but it has infinite less extreme permutations, right? And it raises an uncomfortable question. Why should this feeling of self-satisfaction, right, be something that on its own, right, unconnected to virtue? Why should this be something that we are trying to maximize in people? I think in a way, Hallowell sees the problem, right? So he says, like, it's not sufficient to know how satisfied people are with their lives, since nothing can be done with this information without an informed view of what makes for better lives. Now, how do we get such a view? Well, what Hallowell proposes, right, is that we just need more data. And he cites Aristotle for this. Now, I don't think you can conscript Aristotle into the view that, well, we just need to collect more data and see what really makes people more satisfied with their lives, right? Because again, there's the normative problem, right? Most people might might be self-satisfied in the wrong sense. And this is something that Aristotle was very attuned to, right? So Aristotle says, I mean, in his diagnosis of the vicious man, the wicked man, he says, well, he's really in the most dangerous position of all, precisely because he doesn't even know that he isn't living well, and he is satisfied with his life, right? So there's a problem here, I think, and that it's a problem that is constantly returning when you have the philosopher and the social scientist together. And the problem comes up in the well-being literature as well, right? So if you look at Fletcher's article, this is chapter 7, he's talking about well-being as the quality or state had by a life that's going well. So really the question about well-being is just, okay, well, what are the things that are going to contribute to a life's going well? And we can think about those things. Again, I guess my worry there is that it's unclear to me how this rules out someone who is wicked, right, attaining well-being. Because if you look at what's on those lists, it seems like wicked people might have a pretty good chance of acquiring those things for themselves. And so we need some way of ruling out or decoupling, right, happiness, well-being from wickedness, from vice. And I think we also, well, I'll separate the question about sorting out environmental problems from agental problems, but that's obviously a problem as well. And finally, I just want to turn now to meaning, right? So in the chapter, well, there were a bunch of chapters on meaning, but Baumeister is often invoked, right? Defining meaning as having a sense of the greater context of the importance or value of your life, right? And if you dig deeper and go into the three aspects of meaning, right? So these are significance, right? Feeling a sense of importance or value in your existence and your activities. Coherence, right? Which is the perception that your life and values and relation to the world express some kind of intelligible pattern, part of a context or narrative that you can make sense of. And direction, right? So having objectives that help direct, prioritize, and make sense of your choices and goals. Yeah, I think the normative problem is that all of this seems compatible with wickedness, right? So you can imagine a wicked person having a meaningful life and hitting these criteria. So in conclusion, right, just to sharpen the normative problem, if we want to say that happiness and meaning in life are intrinsically choice-worthy things, right? That they are goals for public policy and for joint practical deliberation, and we should aim to promote them, then I think we just have to operationalize these concepts in a way that does rule out wickedness. And I think the extent to which we haven't done that, right, then, right, the normative problem remains.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Frey. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Pakaluk.
Thank you. I am so pleased to be joining you for this discussion. And I'm also just want to say how pleased I am that Brandon invited me to participate, because a 550-page book sitting on my desk may not have been read as quickly. But I mean this not just as a kind of humorous gesture, but also to say that, boy, this was like a little bit of water in the desert as a social scientist who has been grappling with a lot of these questions for a long time. So I'm coming from the perspective of an applied economist, mostly doing a lot of theory work also in economics and in relation, especially to what we would call applied microeconomics, which really ultimately is quite interested in human goods and measuring human goods. So this was so welcome to read this. I started by asking our moderator, and Brandon, which chapters I should focus on, but I have to confess, I started there and I just kept going, not in order, but it was really a pleasure. So I have just a couple remarks. I've got a couple of larger picture comments, which will come from, particularly my experience and the things that I grapple with as a scholar, but perhaps which can assist this interdisciplinary dialogue that we're engaged in. I want to say just at the outset that I learned a great deal reading through these chapters, and so to anybody listening, I just want to encourage you. It's very easy to look at such a large text and kind of worry that there's just so many details. But I learned a great deal. I have been very familiar with hedonic measures of life satisfaction and how well they work in some settings. But I'm not very well familiar with these attempts to measure kind of eudaimonistic assessments of human happiness. So this was very interesting to me, and I could think of all kinds of ways I'd like to ask whether they have been used already in things that I'm interested in. In terms of the big picture as an economist, I guess I have kind of two related big picture questions really for discussion, and maybe for Matt to answer, because this is, of course, not my area of expertise. Economists generally sort of want to look at the measures, grab the outcomes and then run with them. We don't spend an awful lot of time in general developing measures. So this is very interesting to me. I am going to share my screen briefly, if that's all right. It's I just have one slide. Let's see if this works. Okay, I don't know if you can, I'm hoping you can see this. So I found myself asking as I picked through the chapters, my apologies. I mean, compared to the very beautiful and rich models that Matt presented earlier, economists have very, very sort of straightforward thinking about things. But I found myself asking, are we interested here? I mean, I take this volume to be a contribution to the first thing on this list, it's interested mostly in measuring well-being, and not so much, at least in the chapters here, in the determinants of well-being. So what are the things which cause or affect variation in well-being? Are there robust measures of well-being, and what kind of well-being are we measuring? Now, I wish I was in a setting without Zoom where Matt could sort of immediately correct me and help me understand better. Economists would tend to call the first of these things an accounting equation, right? So an identity, it's not necessarily additive, but sort of well-being just is these things. It's a description of life satisfaction, it's positive affect, it's negative affect, right? It's these things, and this is what we call well-being. The second would be something like a functional form. It wouldn't matter too much what the functional form is, but these would be sort of causal or functional relationships. And sort of my question, just, you know, it may not be determined kind of exactly what we're up to, but the economist in me would want to know which of these things are we mostly up to. For social scientists who work, at least in my kinds of fields, there's a difference between these two operational kinds of statements. And sometimes it's hard, in fact, maybe impossible to tell the difference between the two, even when we understand the difference between the two. And this just raises the general problem in the social sciences with operationalizing a measure of something that is obviously, in some specific sense, only a mere signal of what it is that we're interested in, the reality or the truth of the thing underneath. And at the same time, I wonder that when philosophers use the very elegant language, and Jen can help us understand this, when philosophers use the elegant language of to give an account of something like human happiness, and we have competing accounts, when a philosopher gives an account, is the philosopher interested in describing, you know, this is what happiness is composed of, or is a philosopher more interested in what are the things which cause or give rise to well-being? I think that some treatments in this book are a little bit muddy on which of the two we're up to. And I kind of want to suggest that it looks in a very casual way, and I'm gonna actually stop sharing my screen now. I don't think you need to stare at this forever. It looks in a casual way. Did I fail to stop the share? Okay. It looks casually as if some of the hedonic measures are more interested in these kind of compositional or descriptive, and I would even say positive measures of happiness, and as if the eudaimonic measurements are a little bit more interested in explanatory or normative accounts. But I'm not sure if this is correct. I haven't thought deeply about this, so I'm raising this as a point for conversation. The second point that I want to make, which is related to the first, but not precisely the same, is just sort of briefly, a couple of the authors and chapters touched on what we would typically call kind of the mapping problem from the sort of the domain. I mean, these measures are maps from the domain of human happiness. I mean, there's some reality of happiness or well-being. We understand what the reality is, or we think we know what the reality is. We want to get some sort of measure. So this is a map, and maps are necessarily incomplete. They don't. But a couple of the authors, I want to say Burrell in particular, raised the question of the invertibility of this map. And, you know, I think that Professor Frey is asking a similar question, right? I mean, to what extent are we going to miss certain things? Are we going to attribute happiness or well-being to some people who are truly wicked or not virtuous? And we wouldn't want to be doing that on a regular basis. But maybe these are not so bad at capturing these things. So I'm interested in that, the invertibility. The invertibility of the map means a lot for policy questions. And of course, economists are more or less obsessed with policy questions. So I kind of want to go there next and then finish on that note. You know, it's easier to redistribute in various ways the things that seem to be more related to the hedonic measures of happiness than the eudaimonistic ones. It's kind of clear. So it's better and easier to use these hedonic measures for policy considerations. It's harder to redistribute purpose in life, a sense of autonomy and freedom, and these sorts of things. And so, you know, I think for those obvious reasons, economists, in fact, over the last 100 years at least, we could probably go back a little bit further, have been generally more interested in measures that track more closely with those hedonic measurements. And I don't know to what extent economists as a group have been simply ignorant of these other measures, but I for one, am very much interested in them and learning more about how to use them. It would be an interesting topic for a separate panel, the extent to which some of the early splits in economic theory, I'm thinking of the Austrian splits defined by Karl Menger and later Mises. These splits, in fact, relate to the role of human agency and autonomy and freedom and purpose in economic life and in models that aim to describe the same thing. And so I wonder to what extent these sort of more sophisticated models that deal again with purpose and agency in a better way could be more useful to some of these competing debates within economic theory. And I'm very interested now in learning more about that. I have two final very tiny points, and these are just things that occurred to me as I worked through the volume. The first is I was struck by the fact that children are completely absent from this volume. Now, this might just be that that's a whole separate field, measuring well-being in children. There are certainly issues with self-reports for children, but I was deeply interested in knowing whether or not any of this has been worked out for the case of children. And then the other piece of it is I was deeply surprised not to find any hint, at least, of whether and how having children is related to measures of well-being in adults. So this was completely absent. It wasn't even in the index anywhere. So I thought this was curious, and it could be that that's just a whole nother field, but it seemed somewhat amazing to me. I was curious about that. Someone who's read and studied a lot of Hans-Peter Kohler's work on partnerships and fertility in relation to happiness. So that was just something that struck me. Question about whether these measures work equally well for men and for women. And my last point is I want to say that Colin Fairley's chapter 6 on positive biology and well-ordered science really was like water in the desert. And this question of describing the flourishing members of the species is something that's really motivated me for many years. So to sort of unpack that chapter and read through that, I just thought that was fantastic. So my multiple congratulations to the editors. I think this is a volume that's going to be very close on my desk for a long time. And I'm looking forward to some conversation.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Now I invite Dr. Weston.
Thank you, Brandon. I have adopted the other reading strategy. I just read the thing straight through because I wasn't sure which parts would grab me the most. There is the one chapter appealing to sociologists about a template for measuring communities. But otherwise, I was mostly watching an argument, I thought, between psychologists and philosophers, which was helpful, rich, and interesting. But it did keep me thinking about other topics that I wish there had been more of. And sociologists look at the collective. And so I was looking for the measures of flourishing in a community and even measures of flourishing in a nation state, which is a harder thing to do. I teach actually 2 different courses on happiness, and these are Aristotle heavy ones. So we're talking about eudaimonia and reading that in the broadest sense of what happiness is. And we start with the psychologists and we work up to the economists, and Brandon, you and I need to develop this positive sociology or whatever it would be that would take these measures to the community. That said, when I was thinking about what excuse me, Professor Frey was talking about of the Eichmann problem, sociologists, why don't we have this problem? Because we figure that in the main, if you take all of the people, the idiosyncrasies of the tails of the distribution will wash out, and that the central tendency, which is where we focus, will be more instructive about what the society as a whole is, which is what we're interested in. But also, my personal sense is that our conception of human nature, the one I embrace, is indeed, as Professor Frey was saying, necessarily normative. It's necessarily, as was said in the book a couple places, to choose a philosophical stance. And my expectation is that the norm in society as a whole would be a signpost toward what is actually virtuous and leads us to flourishing, right? Not everybody does it, God knows, and not all the structures of society are virtuous, but it is actually relevant evidence. And that is helpful, that the collective tendency is toward the virtuous, which then leads us back. What sociologists look at is different groups in society, maybe representing different, not modes of flourishing, but levels of flourishing. So when I read the very interesting comparative chapter about the different measures of flourishing that included the dark triad and the rich and sexy scale, which I had not previously met, it occurred to me, and I haven't thought this through, this is a rough idea, that they may be scales measuring lower to higher senses of what actually makes for flourishing. That there is a portion of society that thinks that they would be best served by embracing the dark triad. There's another one, the rich and sexy scale was the outlier in most of the measures of what mattered, that thinks that they would be happy if they were rich and sexy. My guess is that the hedonism measures would fall above that. Then there'd be a group that would take life satisfaction from a desire satisfaction rather from a individual perspective without attempting to have some sense of what is actually satisfying for a population as a whole. And that the eudaimonic measures would be at the higher end. And indeed, I found very helpful the chapters that to try to include theological assessments of what the big picture really would look like. Other people might scale this differently. We could have an interesting argument on that. But this would allow us a way of reconciling not only the philosophical differences behind these views, but even the empirical measures that we would find, that we would expect different groups in society would attempt different approaches to flourishing, and which would be less successful than a fully developed virtues-oriented eudaimonic theory of what is it that actually makes our lives better. Now, I'll add one further thing here just to give us something to poke at. Brandon Vaidyanathan and I have been involved in a critical realism discussion of how to think about communities, how communities can become real. And that was a really helpful idea, that things can emerge into reality. And with that in mind, I was impressed with the importance of purpose in several of the scales and several of the arguments, as not only an argument, but as a predictor of outcomes in flourishing and happiness and whatever the outcome measures were. And likewise, strong mission, that was in one of the scales that was both in the book and that Professor Lee just talked about, that communities with a strong mission, with a sense of purpose, would be more likely to emerge to full reality as causal agents, and that they would be better able to create social structures that would encouraging the flourishing of the populations within them. And even perhaps, and this is a further stretch, but going to the larger point that Professor Lee was showing in the charts, addressing equity across the whole of society, and not just within the most flourishing group. I appreciated all of the attempts at measures. I have used some of them. I learned a bunch of new ones. I thought the final section, the argument about which kind of measures mattered, and in particular the claim that the social measures counted as sort of background or environment for flourishing, but were not themselves elements of it. That gave me food for thought. I had to think about that quite a bit. I'm still chewing on that. I will also just mention in passing that the whole chapter on inner peace, that's one I hadn't even thought about before. And I will have to think about how that fits in with a frankly more action-oriented view of how I read Aristotle and the eudaimonic tradition. So I agree with my my other panelists that this is a really fruitful attempt. We will be helped by attempting to put numbers, measures to these highbrow concepts and applying them to actual people. And my only plea would be, and more sociology doing same. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I now invite Dr. Bloom.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I'm talking to you from the cab of my truck. Flight delays left me with, this is the quietest place. And Brandon, please tell me if I'm breaking up. I'll do my best. Matt Lee, wow, fantastic. This is wonderful. I say this in particular, somebody who's leaving academia. I wish we had had this a long time ago, so I'm so just impressed. And then part of the problem of being in the truck is I can't write down some of the things that my colleagues on the panel said. That's so awesome. I love everything you all said. So I'm going to be speaking more. I'm a social psychologist. I study in particular helping and caregiving professionals. So these are pastors and international aid workers and global health workers and social workers. And so I'm going to be thinking, I thought of this a lot through what could I have used when I was researching those kinds of things. So I focused a lot on the final dialogue, because that was speaking more to what are we going to do, particularly as psychologists and social scientists. And one of the things, and I think, I'm not going to speak for you, Matt, but I think this is what you were trying to say in your response to the response. It's a both and. We need some of these single item measures, and I'll talk about why in a minute, but it got me to thinking about the difference between basic and applied or translational research. And so often we get stuck in the basic research camp. And I'd like to propose some thoughts about how to move also into the applied or translational area. How do we do research with the eye towards how it could be put into practice? So on the basic side, so much of what you all said in the book, particularly your first chapter, resonated with me because it goes to what kinds of measures will people actually respond to? So I call this the field of dreams problem. Sometimes as social scientists, we think, well, if we ask it, people will answer. And that's just not true. So sure, we want the best measures we can have, but we want people to answer the questions. And some of these long measures just don't work. And also, I've also been thinking a lot about what kinds of measures might be appropriate for specific populations. One that I wanted to raise a question is children. We don't have much about children. How about populations with different cognitive abilities? My parents thankfully are doing well, but they're in their middle 80s. How would we measure well-being for them with certain kinds of memory loss that's already happening? And in particular, for my work, the idea of how cultural contexts shape the kinds of measures we'd use. I've always wondered, do people from collectivistic cultures, do they get troubled by all of the questions that begin I or have me in it? In my work, we study a lot of people who feel some way called to their work. And so notions of sacrifice are really a part of their well-being. In other words, the complete absence of pain or suffering would not be a part of their well-being. They know they're doing good work when in some ways they feel that they're sacrificing. So that would be another way that we could think of a particular population that we might want to develop certain kinds of measures for. But more particularly, I'm really interested in applied measures. So for example, what kind of measures also help people to understand their well-being? When I used to ask 300 and 400 and 500 question surveys and people actually answered them, we get tons of emails, people saying, well, I thought this would help me understand my well-being, but I'm more confused than I was when I started. What kinds of measures would promote effective responses, help people think about what they could do? And what kinds of measures are best for assessing the efficacy of well-being practices? If we want to help people with their well-being, how can we best assess the efficacy of those practices? Maybe there's some overlap, but I don't know. So one of the reasons I'm leaving academia is to work more in this translational area. How do we take research and put it into practice? So those things came to mind for me. I'm also wondering, I moved from being a quantitative researcher to a multi-method or largely qualitative researcher. And I wonder how we could bring quantitative and qualitative methods together. I guess if I had one complaint about the methods we use, I've just never been sure that they really map onto people's lived experiences. There are not that many studies, at least that I could find, that like gathered narrative data where people just talked about their life, and from that you made some assessments about meaning and purpose, and then had them answer questions. And is what's the correspondence there? I just really don't know about that. And our use of qualitative methods has helped us understand that the way people respond to the quantitative methods, and this is kind of going back to my comment a minute ago, does have something to do with their worldview. And here's an example that we talk about a lot. If you ever see a list of the kinds of jobs or professions in which people are the most satisfied, you're going to see pastors listed there. And indeed, when we would ask pastors survey questions about job and life satisfaction, they always scored really high. And then when we started doing qualitative interviews with some of those same pastors, well, all the pastors answered the quantitative, we would get these really interesting stories that made us wonder, well, gosh, are you really satisfied with your work? It doesn't sound like it. And so we eventually went back and asked about 100 of these pastors, we're getting a sense that maybe you're not satisfied with your job, but then in your survey, you said you really are. And they were like, oh my gosh, well, look, God gave me this job. I should be satisfied. So it was interesting, the difference between what they were telling us and what they were scoring. And then the last one, and several of the panelists have already mentioned this, is just a lot more attention to what I think of as ecosystems of well-being. Not just relationships, of course, those are tremendously important, but how our well-being affects the well-being of others and how their well-being affects us. So even in small collectives like families and work groups, what is that relationship? I think it's different than my well-being and then the group's well-being. There's some notion of a connectedness. I guess the pandemic has got me thinking about this a lot. And then how do we relate the well-being of groups to groups? And I think of that a lot when I think of, I live in the mountains of West Virginia in a community of people that are largely, would call themselves liberal and democratic, in a state that most people would consider themselves conservative and Republican. And yet there we are living very close to each other, interacting. And so how does our well-being, the well-being of individuals affect individuals and groups affect groups? I'm going to end there, but I want to end with another, way to go, woohoo for this wonderful book. I'm so delighted to see it out there. And I know it's going to prompt good research. I know it's going to prompt a good inquiry. Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks, Matt. So I invite all the panelists now to turn on their videos so that everyone can see each other. I think the first thing we can do is to have Matt Lee respond to any of the questions. There was an onslaught of questions, but whatever you would like to respond to for the next couple of minutes before I start feeding you some other questions that have come up. There have been some really great questions in the chat, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope that my fellow panelists can help with some of the chat questions after I wear myself out responding to this onslaught. First of all, I want to thank the respondents for their wonderfully insightful comments and questions. And I can't respond to everything. I'll try to just go through quickly a few things. And so I agree completely with Jennifer about the normative problem. And so that's why we end the book with, what is well-being for, and sort of who gets to decide, and we've got a project on love right now. And one of the theologians on our advisory board says, well, it's not love unless it's linked to a true story. Just because you feel warmth or have close social bonds or whatever, if it's not linked to a kind of a theologically true story, it's not real love. And so these are really important points. And to Catherine's point, yes, we were mainly focused on the accounting equation, which you described as measurement of well-being, rather than the determinants. There were a few chapters that connect well-being to other outcomes. And so I'm thinking about chapters 4 and 5 that look at how well-being is related to health or even mortality. And so when we think about surveys that are used for policy purposes, we often ask people about their physical health, or we have data, objective data about whether their heart is still beating. it's some point in the future. And so we know about mortality and we know about their self-reported health. Why not, and to go back to Jennifer's question, why not also ask them about their character and virtue? And so we, in our flourishing measure that our program uses, developed by Tyler Vanderweel, we have a question that's that asks, to what extent is this true of you? I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. So that's one of the character and virtue items. And as a subjective self-report, you still have all the same problems of, well, how do we know you're not a wicked person who just feels good about your wickedness? And what I've suggested for groups using these tools, and these tools to measure well-being are just tools and they can be misused. But what I've suggested is that folks do kind of a 360 assessment, invite the people who know you well to reflect on your scores with you. And, oh yeah, well, you're quite the narcissist with those 10s across the board out of 10, but actually you're more like a 3. So that brings a dose of reality. And we never really fully escape the problem of interpretive communities. And so which set of standards will be used to construct that true narrative against which these subjective scores or even objective scores are measured. So I just love these conversations. And that's why I'm pleased to see that life improvement science is now explicitly charged with connecting well-being to well-doing. And then again, we have the same problem. How do we determine whether it's really, whether the well in well-doing is what we would want it to be? It is, I think, fruitful to know that some measures of well-being do predict whether a person's heart is beating or not later in some follow-up measure. And so to the extent that we think that a beating heart is a good thing, then maybe some of these things are positive, independent of some third-party assessment of their normativity. Whether we would want everyone to continue to have a beating heart, Eichmann or something, comes to mind. Those are questions that invite rich interdisciplinary dialogue, like the one that we had back in April of 2018. So I don't have a strong defense for the volume in the sense that it did everything. It didn't cover children, and it didn't cover. I mean, the field is just so vast. I think there's something like 14,000 articles on well-being published every year, or something to that effect. So the literature is just really proliferating. And one of the points that I've made is that there doesn't seem to be a strong narrative guiding the proliferation of measures. It just seems like runaway growth, which in the human body we call cancer. So is the field of well-being, mired in runaway growth and proliferation of measures? And so what we tried to do at the end of the volume is to get a consensus. And I think we had 19 or so co-authors who felt that we were onto something. And then the dissenting view was it would be better to ask nothing than to ask what you're asking. And so that's what's so fun about science, is that there's room for people to make a thoughtful argument, and for us to continue to debate that and then agree to disagree. And it's just great fun to be part of that. In terms of Bo talking about the peace chapter, this is where we do have a little, so this is one that I co-authored with a colleague, and we just sort of noticed that most measures of well-being don't include this. And so we thought, why not create a measure that we think does something different than the others and might inform well-being aligned with virtue and meaning and all the rest. And so we included in some of our items a concern with transcending hedonism and materialism. So this measure would be inversely correlated with rich and sexy well-being, which, again, is debatable in terms of whether that is deepest well-being or just sort of the wrong target. And so it's interesting that if you score more highly on the transcending hedonism and materialism domain of inner peace, the new scale that we've offered, you have lower levels of depressive symptoms and anxiety and other kinds of outcomes. So, leading, a lifestyle that's oriented towards rich and sexy well-being might entail a lot of anxiety and other things. And so that tells us something about human nature and, ontologically, what are human beings? Like, what were we created for, and what is our potential? And I agree both about the need to address equity across the whole of society. And as a fellow sociologist, I'm happy for your call for more sociological voices into this dialogue. Chapter 14, I think, is the one on community well-being. And so we don't have as much on the community, but there's a number of domains within that measure: good relationships, proficient leadership, healthy practices, satisfying community, strong mission. You can have a strong and evil mission, so the normativity problem still applies. But sometimes, if you're asking people about proficient leadership within the community, you're asking, to what extent do those in authority in your community, in your organization, in your nation, do they truly care about the well-being of everyone in the community, or can they be trusted by everyone in the community? That kind of brings in a normative framework, and it's still, who gets to decide and who's answering the questions is still important. And then finally, I think, Matt made a number of really helpful points, and this interesting experience, and I've done qualitative and quantitative research in the same project, and I've had this experience too. We wrote a book a few years ago, humbly called The Heart of Religion. The publisher picked the title. But we found that oftentimes we did a national survey, and then we followed up with some Christian exemplars of benevolent service. And we gave them the survey items. And then we talked with them about the survey items. And sometimes they would change their score in the middle of the interview. Or sometimes they would say, oh, that's not what I thought the question meant. Or, oh yeah, I forgot about the central turning point in my life, so that changes all my scores. And so, when we're basing policy only on self-report survey measures, especially, I can't imagine, as you were describing, taking 300 or 400 of these things, what kind of concentration people would have at the end and what that would reflect. When we're basing policies on a limited number of self-report measures, we're going to have bad policy. So we need multiple disciplines informing us about not only, what is the ultimate forms of well-being rather than the penultimate forms. And we've got a chapter from a theologian that talks about that in the book, but also different kinds of measures, and then triangulate these measures together, and then see if we get a coherent picture. And we want to help policymakers understand the value of listening to philosophers who say, wait a minute, your whole study is premised on presuppositions that I don't share. And so, you need to start over, or at least be clear that what you're giving us is a reflection of your presuppositions and not some kind of objective scientific, fact or reality or truth. So I think it's a really lively conversation to have once you've sat with, close to 600 pages and then realized, hey, wait a minute, there's nothing on kids in here, and kids are really essential to well-being. And so you can see just how vast and interesting the topic is. And so I'm really enriched by everything that you've all shared, and looking forward to continuing the dialogue even after the event. And so I guess we can hear from other panelists or take questions from the audience at this point. But thank you all.
Great, thank you. Let me start. Let me throw some questions actually at the panel. I have a few of my own, but there's so many rich questions here. So, perhaps one of the things that's been articulated here in the questions might be helpful to clarify is, one says, does the group understand happiness or human flourishing to be an activity, a process, or a state that is a feeling? So are we all talking about the same thing here, right? And so, and I think elsewhere, someone has asked about the distinction between well-being and flourishing, or happiness and flourishing. So so first of all, what sort of thing is it? Is it an activity or process or state? And should we equate happiness with flourishing, or is it a component? Or again, some of this might be collapsible to the distinction between hedonic and eudaimonic, but perhaps not. So would love thoughts from anyone there. Please.
I mean, it's like questions like catnip to a philosopher. So I'll just take it. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention this in my comments because I just wanted to be disciplined. But yeah, one presupposition that you find again and again is that what we're measuring is a state, right? And I don't think that can be correct. I think that it is an activity, and we can sharpen, right, whatever it is that we think an activity is. But if we're talking about living well, if we're talking about whether your life is going well, there's just no way that you could measure that at a certain you can't locate that to just a particular time or a particular example or whatever, because we're talking about, I mean, part of the problem is just that we're talking about human life, and human life is a very complicated thing. But one thing that I think is true about human life is that because we are rational creatures, right? Our lives aren't just like a series of episodes that then bam, one day it's just over. There's a narrative arc, right, that we and others, right, place on that. And so your life is a kind of story, and any question about whether life is going well needs to be seen in that kind of context. And it just brings to mind Aristotle's remark, like you can't talk about doing well without looking at the whole. And I think that one of the things that would be a huge improvement in these, I mean, you get this, right, with the life satisfaction stuff, you get these questions about like, well, how do I feel about my life as a whole and stuff. But I think that, part of the trouble that we get into when we put those questions in front of people is that we don't give them any way to think about it, right? Because suppose that they're asking, suppose, or some of the questions are like, did you feel anxious yesterday? This was like one of the questions in one of these measurements. And it's like, well, maybe I did, but maybe yesterday it was like, some impossibly anxious thing that I happened to be doing. It's not really relevant, right? And so I think that one of the things that would be salutary is if, when we ask these questions, we give people some kind of sense for how to engage in reflection on answering them well.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Other thoughts on this? Because I think this is one of the central questions, I think, for to make sense of the book, as well as the discussion we're having, is whether there are different ways in which we should understand the kind of thing we're talking about. And is there any value to considering happiness as a state, or flourishing as a state, or a process? If it is an activity, then how do we get our handle around measuring it? Boa,
let me add a further complication here. So we've got results from all over the world with our measures, and we've had conversations with folks from other cultures. And in some cases, people will say, well, look, my sense of flourishing is independent of whether I'm depressed or not today, because, flourishing is the flavorful life, and life is more flavorful when you take the bite of the bitter food and then you take the sweet. And so regardless of my positive or negative affect. I may, just as a matter of principle, say I'm flourishing because I'm integrating these things. And then other people have said, well, in our culture, to score 10 out of 10 on anything is a sign of corruption. Because, you know, if other people are suffering and you're way up here, then you've stolen or something. You've done something nefarious so that you're not participating in the suffering of the community. So Matt's points about sacrifice and suffering as part of well-being are very well taken. We have to think about integrity or wholeness amidst adversity, which is how Francis Su describes it in his book on mathematics, you know, of all topics. So, you know, I think that there's a really rich conversation. The only way we can have these conversations is to start the conversation. So we offer some findings. We offer a framework for understanding the findings. We offer an explanation of how we conceptualize these measures in the first place, and then we tear it apart. And so, you know, science proceeds by knocking down the things that, you know, are not robust enough to keep standing. So I'm just really enjoying this conversation, and I think that all of these points ought to be informing our understanding of well-being.
So,
Ed Diener, you know, who created one of the most widely used measures, said he wanted to measure happiness, but he didn't think happiness sounded scientific enough, so he called it subjective well-being. But really, the enterprise, I'm a lumper rather than a splitter by nature. So when I read eudaimonia, I think it's an action of the soul in accordance with virtue. It's made up of the habits of vice and virtue that we develop over time. And so it is a lifetime process. It's an action that we can take synchronic measures of, particularly if we take them of the whole, right? If we not in any individual, but a population, we can get some sense of. But I'm reading flourishing, happiness, well-being is all pointing toward the same thing. And any measure we can use, and this is the thing Professor Pakaluk said before, they're indicators of the thing. They're not the thing itself. And I don't think we'll ever get to measure the thing itself, but that we have a notion that there's something there, that there is a telos toward flourishing. I do believe, and I do believe that's really what holds together everything in this conversation.
So there's a really question about, you know, perhaps things that are in principle not measurable, right? So here's the question: is measuring flourishing implies quantification? Quantification implies a common denominator. Bentham's utilitarianism assumed that pleasures understood as happiness were all and everywhere the same, hence quantifiable and summative across humans. Does the group assume some form of utilitarianism? Alternatively, Aristotle believed that pleasures could conflict and detract from each other and hence were qualitatively differentiable, therefore not quantifiable across the activities with which they're associated. If this is correct, then how does one address the question of quantifiability? There have been, I think, you know, it's not exactly the same thing, but Michael Polanyi has a critique of Likert scale kinds of measures and sort of which he thinks are sort of really poor substitutes for the sorts of things they're trying to measure, and he thinks they really can't measure those things in principle. So any thoughts on that? Are, you know, I mean, to the extent, I think this has come up again before, it's easier to get a handle on the hedonic kinds of satisfaction, but with the eudaimonic, I mean, to what extent are the measures, even similarly, you know, to the kinds of considerations Matt raised? I mean, so satisfaction with my relationships, if I score that as a 10, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean I'm really complacent? I can't hope for any better in my relationships. You know, I've just not tasted anything better than I currently know. So trying to assess, like, how do we actually make meaningful comparisons of those units, which, you know, I think it's easier to compare, you know, how much money you're earning, or even perhaps how much pain you're in right now, right? Those things that the doctors give you in their offices. Are you on, you know, scale of 0 to 10? But is there something here that is in principle not measurable, not quantifiable, that we're dealing with, and is that an obstacle to this entire endeavor? Matt Bloom, you've got your hand up.
Well, it was hard to tell if that was a person from a philosophy perspective or not, but no, I assume it was. So I'm going to answer as a psychologist. Yes, we're never measuring these things directly. We're always at best measuring some noisy and maybe even shadowy image of what we really are about. So, and we, again, in the world I lived in, we sometimes forget that and we reify our measures and suddenly we say that is, we're actually measuring this real important thing like the quality of my relationship with other people. And I think part of what we have to keep reminding ourselves is that, and this is why I think what Matt did in his book is so important, what everybody's here talking about, let's study this thing from a lot of different perspectives in a lot of different ways. On a more sour note, I think I'm wondering, yeah, maybe this thing is really different in certain cultures, and we're just gonna have to approach it differently there. And we would love if there was some sort of universals, but I don't know, maybe we just have to, again, resign ourselves that there aren't. Now that's not as happy as we can tell the world how to be a happier place, but that may be where we are.
I was going to first affirm the question. It's a wonderful question. And in the chapter by Seth Margolis and others, this is chapter 13 in the book, Empirical Relationships Among 5 Types of Well-Being. The 4 authors, one's a philosopher and the others are social scientists, conclude that to conclude, if social scientists seek to study and promote human well-being, they should illuminate the philosophical value commitments that are implicit in the choice to measure it one way or rather than another. And that assumes they even know what those commitments are. And so I wonder sometimes, and then they should vigorously debate which measure or measures are best for which empirical and policy purposes. And that conversation needs to be much more explicit. But what's the value of doing anything in the interim, even as weak as it might be? Well, we learn from their chapter, this is table 13.7 on page 396, that rich and sexy well-being is the only form of well-being that's positively correlated with narcissism. And narcissism is generally seen as not good. And so it is valuable for, even though there's social desirability and people are not fully in touch with who they really are, and there's all sorts of things going on, these kinds of relationships are still what we would expect, you know, kind of theoretically, if we've read any philosophy and theology, and they show up rather reliably. And so what does that mean? You know, when we start to see patterns around the world showing up rather, that they're robust, that they're rather reliable, it seems like we're tapping into something. So the answer is yes, we need to do more about figuring out, is this really some kind of incompatible, you know, everything, including the kitchen sink approach to well-being, and we need to start pulling these apart and making more meaningful distinctions. But also when we see these kinds of results showing up reliably across groups, we're learning something.
Great, that's really helpful. So I have a question that's why do social scientists, as opposed to economists, tend to remain at arm's length from policy-driven decisions? And how can we increase applications of well-being research on a policy level? What are the first steps to seeing our work translate in a meaningful way in the policy arena? This might be something where we could learn some lessons from economists, or maybe not. Catherine, maybe I'll throw that to you to start. Do you think economists are good at doing this? And is that a place where we might want to look to for advice? Or would you have other recommendations for how this kind of research might actually, perhaps notwithstanding what Jennifer raised questions about why should policymakers even care about what people feel, but you know, are there any implications of this work that could inform or should inform policy, and can economics you know, show us something helpful there?
So those are that's a tangle of a lot of questions. You know, I'm a little bit less sanguine about the possibility that policy will help us in this area, in large part because of, you know, maybe oblique things related to what I said before, right? If we and listen, I mean, chapter 1, I mean, the authors of chapter 1, Hollowell and so on, I mean, really they say this right up. We really don't have what we need. in order to decide that we can affect these things through policy, right? It's one thing to decide we can see the variation, and we can even see what accounts for some of the variation. We can get a little bit past just merely describing, but to say that we can affect those things, we really would have to understand the extent to which, right? I mean, so we say, all right, so just to give you a very clear example, we say, all right, so GDP per capita or sort of income seems to account for some of the variation, at least in life satisfaction measures. Okay, good. But is it that I earned that makes me deeply satisfied, or is it that it was given to me that makes me deeply sad? I mean, if we don't know the answer between those things, then policy will have a very hard time telling the difference. So I guess I'm going to kind of stay agnostic on whether I think policy can help us. I have tended to be rather critical of a lot of the ways in which we've blundered into various sort of policy goals without actually knowing whether or not we can affect the changes we want to affect. And I think this might be a useful time. I wanted to say this in the last question, but it might be a useful time to sort of, Brandon, you mentioned, Polanyi, and I'm recalled to mind because of one of the classes I'm teaching, Hayek's Nobel lecture, where he talks about the pretense of knowledge, and he kind of is upset about, and actually there's a nice analogy that can be drawn between what he's interested in that lecture, which is sort of problems in economic science between the aggregate measures of inflation and unemployment and what, again, can be achieved through government policy. But he uses this particular formulation of the problem with having sort of a true description of reality, which is imperfect, right? It doesn't quite get the whole thing. And something that's very exact and precise, but definitely false, right? And he wants to say that the false but exact is the thing we always really like, because it's just so satisfying to be so precise and exact. And so, you might hear me now as saying, well, okay, so so poo-poo with all the measures, right? But what is so exciting about this book is precisely that. And let me just say that Hayek's concern is that we're kind of tyrannized by the metrics of the exact, where we become tyrannized by what we've measured. And of course, the things we didn't measure, we may be more important, but we didn't measure them. We have no way to build them into policy or programs. And so you might hear this as, well, okay, let's push this aside. But what's so welcome about this volume and the work that's been done by these editors is that, in fact, these are new measures that are better measures than other measures that we've used, right? So I think, for instance, as an economist, I mean, we spend a lot of time with a very small toolkit for how we could think about whether people are doing well in life. I mean, these kind of, labor market outcomes, are you employed? What's your salary? What's your, strict just sort of numbers of, rungs up the ladder of sort of like the game of life or something like that. We have a lot to work with. And so in some sense, this is a really welcome, it's welcome to be offered the opportunity to kind of work with a better set of measures. So, but, there's still measures and they're still sort of false, but exact. So, we can move towards improvements, but we do, I think, have to kind of cultivate a sense of humility about what metrics can do for us.
Yes, Matt.
I just wanted to offer that policy can come in different forms. Like, we could be concerned about organizational policy. How do we get organizations to change? My team and I are concerned about what we're calling personal policy. How do we get people to change the things in their lives and the way they think about their lives? And we moved away from organizational to personal because we felt like we could help individuals more quickly than organizations. They change slowly. But I'm so glad people are thinking about organizations and public policy. So maybe just thinking about policy in different levels or in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so we had used actually the Flourishing Index in one of our studies of congregations. We did a number of surveys of faith communities during the pandemic and even before. And one of the surprising consistent findings is that one of the strongest predictors of flourishing is how frequently people share problems with others in their faith community. And there's some research on problem sharing that makes it sound as though the more you share problems, the more likely it is that you're some sort of complainer or your life isn't really going that well. But in the context of a faith community, something different might be going on. What we were shocked to find was that the average levels of sharing problems were very low across the board in most faith communities, except for African-American Baptist churches. And so we went in and sort of did some qualitative work to find out what was going on. And they have very different structures where you have the ability to come and share your needs in front of people and have people pray over you and so forth. Structures that were very, sort of absent in other kinds of communities where people go in and are complete strangers to each other for the entire duration of their activity in that community. And so that sort of has informed faith leaders about something that we could call policy, right? That maybe we should figure out how to create spaces of friendship and vulnerability. This is a strength we could really cultivate, and we're not doing, right? So maybe something analogous. I don't know. Again, when you scale it to a national level or even broader, I'm not quite sure how those things would translate. But you have to have some theory of what the causal mechanisms at play, and I don't know to what extent we have those in place at the national level. Perhaps we could close with with one final question here, which is going back to, I guess, the happy Nazi problem, which is regarding the approach to solving the virtue wickedness issue. And so this particular participant has noted that the 360 inspection wouldn't really have solved the problem, because even Hitler's acquaintances might have viewed his actions favorably. Is there a danger that if our measures of well-being do not address the wickedness problem, that we're taking steps to promote something we call well-being, but which is not really human flourishing? We promote short-term positivity at the expense of something else that matters more, but is more difficult to measure, essentially, right? And so I wonder if any of you all have thoughts on this. Sorry, I just see a message from Catherine asking if she could comment as well, if it's too late. But yeah, any more solutions to the happy Nazi problem?
I think Jennifer's comments are spot on. Sorry, Matt. I just think what the normative problem is hugely important, and we really don't. At least in social psychology, we just completely wave our hands and turn them up. We shouldn't. Yeah.
Well, one of the points I was going to make, and I didn't maybe say this clear enough in my presentation, is I guess it depends on who is invited to participate in the 360. And so, we've got, for example, there's a chapter in the book by a theologian who argues, from a Christian standpoint, well-being and full well-being in this life is not really possible. You're hoping for salvation in the future. And so if you're fully satisfied now, you're not really paying all that much attention. And so when we think about the conversation about ultimate ends rather than penultimate ends, then we want to invite diverse voices into that conversation, or we get this kind of echo chamber effect going. And really that's about the best we can do, is to be rigorously inclusive, which we're not, so let's just acknowledge that. But I guess where I would leave it is that if the book, first of all, there's not a whole lot of interdisciplinary conversation going on, at least as I've surveyed the field, unless you organize an event and draw people to it. Sociologists, I'm a sociologist, we tend to just stick to our thing. And so we're hoping that the book, that people who would read the book would say, this is worth having, these interdisciplinary conversations are worth having, and that the book raises more questions that it answers. And I want to get active in answering those questions. And I want my voice to be part of this 360 review, because there's a perspective that's missing and I can add that. So if that happens, then the book is a success.
Brandon, sorry, I just wanted to speak. I just wanted to say a small thing in defense of the statistics and the measurements, maybe which can help put Professor Frey at ease, I'm not sure, but which is, I remember it's been a number of years now when I first encountered sort of life satisfaction measures, and I think a lot of us, who are familiar with, the facts like, doing hard things often leads to, to sort of short-term pains, but long-term gains. I mean, things that are a little bit more difficult, you go like, all right, these measures can't possibly be getting things right. But I kind of want to say that it's probably the case that we can do some kind of, if it hasn't been done already, some kind of, meta assessment of in the big samples of data that we have, some kind of assessment of whether we're really in general kind of getting this wrong. So variation does a lot of work for us. So of course we care in these larger samples about variation. And when I looked at the covariates of scoring high on life satisfaction measures, like I want to say this was 10 years ago, the last time I looked deeply in this literature, I thought it was kind of remarkable that you drill down, you go, wow, it's kind of correlated with the good stuff. Like you don't look at the list and go, wow, look at all these drug addicts that are, scoring really high on. It's actually, for myself, I looked at the list and looked at all the covariates, obviously it's just covariates. You're not getting anything, you kind of go like, well, this is way more successful than you would have thought it would be. You're not catching a whole bunch of stuff that, you would think, would tell you there's a ton of a ton of weird stuff happening with these measures, which is just to say, well, maybe we're not measuring virtue. We probably aren't measuring virtue, but we're not getting something that's so noisy and chaotic that I think we're routinely catching, mastermind criminals, Nazis, and very wicked people. And I kind of, this is the point where, and with all respect, I'm married to a philosopher, so I do this all the time. There's a moment in the dialogue at home all the time when I go, this is back on the philosopher to explain to me the theory sort of, kind of, let's dig into the unity of the virtues here. And what is the idea that you could have these folks that are sort of walking around and like mastermind criminals, but somehow they'd be scoring really high and all of these other, things that relational things and things that we think are, typically substantive of the human good. Like I'd be more optimistic that the quality of the human good or human excellence, which I think the Aristotelian framework helps us to understand and illuminates in maybe the best way that I know, is robust. Like it's not the sort of thing that that's something, it's a description that's imperfect but true of human flourishing. And it's kind of robust that actually it's like, I don't think we're getting it wildly wrong. Now, it's not perfect, but it's probably not wildly wrong. And that's actually astonishing to me. It's one of the things that makes this really exciting, I think, because it's not terribly wrong. But Matt can really probably update, it was 10 years when I looked at all those covariants. So you can probably update this for me. You probably have better evidence that we're not catching, tons and tons of criminals.
I agree with you completely. I don't have good data about that, but so I think I'm going to speak in agreement with you in two ways. One, I don't know. And of course, we love the fact that if we gather lots of data, we average out the wackos and the, all of the tails. So I don't know whether we're doing that or not. And I appreciate raising the normative problem too. It's a wonderful thought exercise that can help us understand the normal people better. And there's so much research on, there's research on affective forecasting. I think this is going to make me happy, and it doesn't. That can call into question these. So anyway, I think you're spot on. We're not wildly off the mark, and let's try to be better.
I'm just going to jump in for 1 second. So I think that, so first of all, I think we should be trying to collect this data. I don't think that it's just, a ridiculous enterprise. However, I just think, if you look at the questions that are being asked, it's unclear how you could disambiguate, like just in terms of, you give these questions to someone, it's unclear how they could disambiguate, right, between the shallow sense of happiness and the deep, rich sense of happiness, or the, the shallow sense of well-being from the human flourishing sense of well-being. And so really, I guess what I'm suggesting is that you could suggest ways for people to better disambiguate these terms. Like you could acknowledge that happiness is understood in many ways, well-being is understood in many ways, and you can prompt reflection in certain ways. And of course you can do the meta-analysis, which is very important. But when you're doing that meta-analysis, you have to bring to that analysis some kind of ideal, right, by which you're getting out the bad data from the good data. There has to be some kind of sorting. mechanism there that is itself normative. And so I think that it's totally wonderful if social scientists, of all stripes can agree on this. What I've found in some of my work is that some of them are like, yeah, it's a problem. And some of them are incredibly tied to a self-conception that what they do is descriptive. And if they it's nothing but descriptive. And if they let go of that, it's no longer a science. Right. And so I might just be in really friendly company today, which is great. But I've definitely also been in very unfriendly company on this particular point.
Yeah, it's hard to find descriptions that are not shaped by some tradition, right? Some interpretive tradition that has various normative assumptions baked into it. And so this has been such an exciting conversation. Again, for me, I'm really thrilled because we were trying to over here begin the process of starting a center for the study of institutional flourishing. So taking this conversation to understand beyond individual well-being, what does it mean to think of the well-being of groups, communities, systems, and so on. And so a lot of that's been going to continue to be informed by this volume and the considerations raised in this conversation. Matt, can I offer you the last word as we close?
Yes, I just really appreciate everyone today contributing to this deeper collective wisdom. I was going to note that in that table 13.7 I referred to earlier, that Machiavellianism is positively related to rich and sexy well-being and negatively related to eudaimonia. So we do sometimes see what we expect, and it's worth involving many disciplines in the sense-making process, and then the creation of even better measures that are more persuasive to everyone. So thank you all for contributing to that effort, very broadly conceived.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for those of you who joined us as well. And good night to you all.